member of the National Book Critics Circle. I organized this panel with Marcela, who's videoing us the National Book Critics Circle likes to foster the discussion of books, so we were delighted to collaborate with George Mason for their fall for the book. I have some intro things they've asked me to say. We're going to rip through that as quickly as possible so that we can get to the fun part, which is actually, talking to these wonderful writers, and I will introduce them in a moment as well. Just so you know, I know that the topic of this panel is extensively why the memoir is popular, and I do hope that we get to that topic too, but that's not what we're going to restrict ourselves to, particularly with so many people in the room who are actually working on memoirs. I think we'll probably be addressing a lot of questions about the process. And the way we'll run it is, I'll go through this quick introduction. I will start the questioning to kind of get some material out, and then we'll start taking questions from the audience, since I'm sure that you guys will have a lot of your own questions for these authors. Okay? So what I need to say to you. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the 13th annual Fall for the Book Literary Festival. This year's festival hosts nearly 150 authors appearing at events throughout Northern Virginia, DC, and Maryland. We appreciate your attendance today and encourage you to attend some of the other events at the festival. There's a program of festival events that's in the back of the room, so if you haven't gotten one yet and you want to attend other things, you can grab one of those. There's also more information available at www.fallforthebook.org. Again, that's www.fallforthebook.org. If you have not already done so, please remember to turn off or silence your cell phones. Please also help us improve the festival for next year by filling out a survey at the end of our panel. We were kind of scattered along the seats, and I think there's some more back there if you haven't gotten one. The information we collect from these helps us to better serve you in the future, so thank you in advance. There will be some book signing at the end of the panel. I believe books will also be on sale, so if you hear something that catches your interest and you want to get a book and get it signed, you can do that right after this. The National Book Critics Circle is a co-sponsor for this evening's panel. Founded in 1974, the NBCC represents some 600 member critics, authors, literary bloggers, and book publishing personnel, and provides free daily online content on the rapidly evolving world of books at its website, www.bookcritics.org. Again, that's www.bookcritics.org. Every year, the NBCC gives out awards in 6 different literary categories, including autobiography and memoir. I believe these are the only book awards in the country that are given out just by critics, not just by foundations. So we are a tough audience, let me tell you. If you'd like to learn more about our organization, you can sign up. There's an email mailing list you can sign up for at the back, or you can speak to Mark Apatakis or me after the panel. We'd be happy to talk to you more about that. Now, let's get to the big part. I'm going to introduce our distinguished panel of writers. From the end coming forward is E. Ethelbert Miller, who is the author of 2 memoirs. The first is Fathering Words, The Making of an African-American Writer, which was selected as a DC reread for its One Book, One City program, sponsored by the DC Public Libraries. His second memoir is Fifth Inning, in which he discusses baseball, quote, baseball, the game of his youth, in order to find a metaphor that will provide the measurement of his life. He's also a poet and has a whole long list of many accomplishments, which you can find if you look in the bios online. But I'm going to be very brief with each of you. Their accomplishments are so long that we've spent half our panel discussing them. So going forward, there's Peter Manseau, is the author of the memoir Vows, the story of a priest, a nun, and their son. This is their son. He is also a novelist who has written songs for the Butcher's Daughter, and also has a new nonfiction book that came out not too long ago called The Rag and Bone. He's also won many awards. There's also Ariel Sabar, who is here, who's, I'm going to lose your subtitle. Who's the author of the book, oh my gosh, you're gone. My Father's Paradise. I'm going to have to ask you to give the subtitle because it's my sheet.
Well, the hardcover subtitle was "A Son Search for His Jewish Past in Kurdish Iraq."
Thank you very much. And Ariel is known to me from before too, because he actually was the winner of one of the National Book Critics Circle's autobiography awards in 2008, and has also many illustrious other accomplishments under his belt, which you can again find on the fallofhis.org website if you look under the author bios. So one thing that sort of stuck out when I realized that we had you all together here is that all of you, in some way or another, are writing about family in your books. And writing about family seems to me a particularly loaded topic. I mean, we're not just writing about yourselves, you're writing about people who you're very close to. Ethelbert, in an essay in which he wrote about recovering from writing his first memoir, said, quote, "Well, it's done and I'm still alive." Which seemed to capture a certain, I don't know if you both also felt like that, but let's just begin with why you decided to write about your family, whether that was a difficult decision to undertake. We'll take it from there. A lot more to explore along those lines. Where do you want to start?
That's an easy question for me to answer. I started writing a memoir because of loss within my family. I lost my brother first, and then I lost my father. My brother's death was a complete shock to me. He died in his sleep. He was a major influence on my life. When you lose your older brothers, it just changes the perspective. I never, for example, had buried anyone. When I went back to New York, greeted by my mother and my father, my sister, they looked to me because I went off to college. Well, now I use all that college education, to help us organize this funeral. And it was the first time I ever dealt with picking out a coffin, consoling, comforting the family. And when my father died, I realized also that, okay, here were the two men in my family gone. And I realized that poetry as a genre was not large enough for my grief. Okay, so there's the title of my book, Fathering Words. I had to father more words to handle this grief. And so the book was written without any revision. It sort of came to me like revelation. And if someone said that I had to do revision, I don't know if I could have. Keep in mind, I was a poet who wrote short poems. And so for this was a completely new undertaking. But I felt it was a process of healing. Okay, a process of healing. And that was where I felt very comfortable. And I was glad that I was able to be a writer because I was able to preserve the memory of both my father and my mother.
Peter, you want to talk about why you chose to write about it?
Sure. Well, I had the lucky misfortune of being born into an interesting family. My father is a Catholic priest, and my mother was a Catholic nun when they met, as my subtitle suggests. And for a while, I guess as soon as I knew that I wanted to be a writer, which is going back to when I was in university, I knew I would eventually write this story. But I also had other things to do, I thought, for a while. I mostly wanted to be a novelist, which I eventually became after I got the story out of my system. But it just, circumstance led me to write this book first. It ended up being the first story I had to write. And as much as the story ultimately became, and I should say that the story I ended up writing is about my family, first of all, but I also used my parents' experience of joining the Catholic Church, entering religious life, deciding to leave. I used their story as a way of talking about the history of the Catholic Church in America, putting it in a larger cultural context, which at the time that I was writing the book was on a lot of people's minds, most specifically because of the sex abuse crisis in the Catholic Church, which is really what, in some way, allowed my book to happen. Because it made publishers think, well, it's time for a big Catholic book. and I don't, as much as it ended up being a wonderful experience for my family, collaboratively, collectively, it also, I had very practical reasons for writing. I wanted to be a writer, and this was my goal in life. And a writer writes the story he has, and he makes the books that the publisher is willing to make. So when you find yourself with something that is a saleable story, you ask yourself, well, am I willing to do this? And for me, the question was not, whether or not I was willing to sell out my family to make a book, but how much? How much I was willing to sell out my family. And the answer for me was that I would do this if my parents were okay with it. If they were on board with it and would allow me to interview them and learn about their lives that way, so it wasn't just my imagination of their experience, then I would do it. And I also found myself asking myself throughout the process, and it'd be interesting to hear your feelings on this. Well, I ultimately had to decide, well, what's more important, your book or your family? And some novels that come out about, memoirs that come out about families, you feel like, well, this person clearly decided the book is more important than the family. These are the bridge-burning memoirs that a friend of mine recently suggested should all have the title of Daddy, Why? That's not the kind of book I wanted to write. I wanted to write a book and not only survive it, but to feel better about having told the story. I hope that's okay.
So my memoirs, I guess, a little unusual in that, well, maybe somewhat like yours in that I don't really see myself as the main character. I see my father as the main character. And my dad, just to sort of give you a quick background on the book, my father was born in a mud hut to an illiterate teenage mother in the mountains of Kurdish Iraq in the 1930s. This was an ancient, sort of forgotten community of Jews that were native speakers of Aramaic. I mean, this was a language that was long thought dead. It was a language of Jesus. It was the language of the Babylonian Talmud, the definitive book of Jewish laws. But certainly it was a language even scholars had written off as long dead. But up in the mountains of Iraq, Turkey, and Syria, there were still isolated and sort of forgotten groups of Jews and Christians who continued speaking this 3,000-year-old language. But by the time I was born, in 1971, my father was a tenured professor at UCLA. And I was growing up this kind of all-American kid, wanting to be the kind of consummate Southern California boy. I read Surfer magazine for fashion advice. I skateboarded. I played in a band that worshipped the Red Hot Chili Peppers. And I just wanted nothing to do with my dad. I mean, he looked funny, he talked funny. He came from this place I couldn't even point to on a map. And this was the 1980s. LA is sort of a superficial place in any era, but I think the 80s were notable in that regard. And I just sort of bought into it, into the sort of values of the place, very superficial values. And for me, what changed, and I had gone off and become a writer, but a writer of largely of other people's stories. I was a newspaper reporter, a daily newspaper reporter, churning out copy every day on everything from murders to fires to government corruption, working my way up through a series of newspaper jobs, and not really ever thinking that my father had anything interesting to say, or that his own story, which would turn out to be quite remarkable, was worthy of publication. And I think that what changed that for me was having my own son back in 2002, and there's this sort of this discovery that comes to people, I think, a sense of continuity, especially for a kid like me who, growing up in LA, thinking I could really write my own story, that wherever I came from didn't matter. Whoever my dad was had nothing to do with who I was. When you have a child, there's this reminder, there's kind of a comeuppance in a way, that you're not the end of the line, but you're sort of this link between these two generations, and in my case, I think very, very different ones. You have this very sort of ancient community in the mountains of Kurdistan, sort of barely literate in many ways. Western scholars were sort of barely cognizant of them. And then you have a son growing up in Maryland, in Anne Arundel County, Maryland, but now in D.C. And how do you connect these two things? And for me, it wasn't so much a process of bridge. What was the word used? Bridge burning, but bridge building, and the linking of this sort of faraway past with this very sort of forward-looking present that my son was growing up in. And what was I going to do as a writer to sort of link those two generations?
Now, when people talk about memoir, I think one of the things that pops to mind is the me part of the memoir. That they think of these stories as being primarily stories about the author, and yet all of your memoirs, although you are characters in your memoir or you express yourselves in your memoir, you also often actually shift the focus off of yourself.
I definitely did that in Fathering Words.
I was going to say you had
Yeah,
your sister.
I created my sister's voice,
Exactly.
and that was easy to do because I was writing poems with someone that was stepping outside of myself. But I did it because I was the baby of the family. How many people are baby of the family? You're the baby, okay. I grew up thinking my name was Shh, because what was going on, and see, So what happened, there's a lot of things in terms of family history I just didn't know, okay. And keep in mind, if you're, for example, a young woman in a family, many times when you're getting your hair combed or braided, when you're in the kitchen, many times you learn the family story. Now, guys may have to go to the barber shop or something, or the basketball court to hear some story, but you hear a lot of things in the kitchen and places where women gather. Being a baby family, I just didn't think it was just kept from me. And so what happened, as I started looking at my family, I realized, okay, my sister knew, especially when you talk about those early chapters, my sister knew the story. Now, when I started writing, I didn't know I was going to keep her voice, throughout the entire book. And then once the book was finished, the first reader I was concerned about was my sister, okay? And there was some issues of privacy where I had to ask, okay, do I have permission to write this? Because I felt that this was something that was very personal. She said, okay. And then what happened is that she received a copy of the Galleys. I happened to call her when she was writing, this is the early days of email, when she was writing a letter to me. Okay? And I have in my possession one of the few letters that my sister ever wrote to me. Think about it in your family. Many times in family, you don't get letters from family members. And my family, my father and mother deceased. I have about maybe one letter from my father. This was not letter writers. Okay? But what happened? My sister, I called her. She just finished reading the book. She was crying. What's wrong with the book? She said, I love this book. You captured things I could not say. For me as an author, and I know this is the critic panel, they didn't put it together. I didn't care what any critics did. My sister liked it. That was good enough for me.
And Peter, can you talk about, actually let's start with Ariel this time, since we went last time. Can you talk a little bit about shifting the focus off of yourself mostly? I mean, you had, I know there are parts of your book in which you talk about your surfer mentality and the contrast between you and your father, but most of the book seems really oriented around him. And so can you talk about your process as a writer deciding to do that and how you...
Well, I didn't think my story was particularly interesting. I mean, I think that, there's, I think this is a good one to make it. Any memoir panel, just because you have parents and you have a child, it doesn't mean you have a memoir. I mean, so there's a sense that you have to decide where the story is. And there is a sort of explosion of memoir now. And I mean, Facebook is sort of and Twitter are sort of moment-to-moment memoirs in some ways, although I wouldn't describe them as memoir, for reasons we can discuss later. But we're in this sort of confessional age, and I just sort of looking as a journalist who every day had to craft stories, and I was lucky that my first newspaper job was at the Providence Journal in Rhode Island, which had this reputation as a writer's paper. It encouraged reporters to tell stories. As one of my editors, wise editors, said early on in my journalism career, people don't curl up at night with a great set of facts. So you're constantly assessing as a daily journalist, what is a story? What makes a good story? And Bret Easton Ellis had written, less than zero already. I didn't think I could add anything to sort of, the drug-addled life of a Los Angeles teenager. I wasn't a drug user, but I was among kids who were. It's been done. I don't think it's particularly interesting or particularly deep. And so where did I have something new to say? And for me, it was, in addition to these are very personal reasons I have to write a story, which is sort of make amends with my father and to finally understand this man who I had kept at arm's length for so long. There was the professional side, and all of us as writers were negotiating, is this for professional and personal? That's where the story was. The story of the Kurdish Jews, who were the oldest part of the diaspora, they weren't just obscure, but they could connect to stuff that people knew already. They could connect to the Assyrian exile, which was the first exile from the Holy Land. Before the Babylonians moved a whole bunch of Jews to the center of Iraq, the Assyrians, who were the sort of emperors before them, moved an earlier bunch of Jews to Assyria, which is basically Kurdistan. So it connected to something big. It connected to something in the Bible. They spoke Aramaic, which was this incredibly important language both in Christianity and in Judaism. And my father winds up in Los Angeles, which also has sort of a lot of resonance for people. And this is sort of a fun part of the book, you know, he winds up, even though he's like the least glamorous and the least cool guy you've ever met, he still doesn't, refuses to go to a barber about his hair. He cuts it with razor combs, and if you've ever seen these, they're combs that have little razors between the teeth, and you take off huge clumps of hair. The least LA of men, but occasionally, because we live in Los Angeles, like the X-Files would call him up, or a Hollywood studio would call him up, because they needed someone to write dialogue in a language only God would understand. And so, like, there are all these little things that I knew that if I pieced together, made for a story that that was transcendent. And I think when we talk about what distinguishes a personal narrative or something that happened to you from memoir, in sort of memoir as art, I think sort of home, and we can talk about more on this sort of idea of transcendence. It can't just be about you, and I don't mean that it also has to be about other people in your family, but it has to be about something universal in the human condition, the human experience, so that other readers who may be a million miles from what you're writing about can see something of their own humanity or something in their parents' humanity in your writing. And we have better days and worse days, but when we succeed, I think that's what good memory is.
So it sounds like Ethelbert, your decision to shift the focus on you because your primary motivation is around your personal exploration of all the things that have been shushed.
That's true too.
And that in some ways, Ariel, yours was considering what would be of interest primarily of a larger public. So Peter, where are you following? I know I'm simplifying because you're also dealing with issues of fatherhood and issues that are beyond you. But as far as your initial impulse going into it,
Well, I've always been along with the storytelling aspect. I'm always concerned about what that's personal, but a witness to. That's the key thing. And sometimes what happens is that people pick up the memoir, but the story they didn't realize you were telling. So, for example, when people look at my memoir, it's also a story of the Black Arts Movement, particular time. You might say, okay, what was going on, at this time?
that's what I'm saying. I know I'm simplifying.
Right.
But when you went into it, what you wanted was a kind of personal.
No,
discovery?
because I knew, being a political poet,
Yes.
I knew that I was making statements about the African American family. I knew I was making statements about the 60s and 70s, period I lived through, the sort of coming of age and consciousness, identity. So all those were like topics I was very much aware of.
Peter, do you want to talk a little bit about why you decided not? I mean, you were actually a fairly important character in your memoir as well.
I didn't intend to be.
Yeah.
I didn't think I'd be there at all. In fact, I thought, well, growing up with this peculiar upbringing, and I should explain a little bit. My father still technically is a Catholic priest. My mother is formerly a nun. She left the convent when they married quite happily. But my father, as a protest against the Catholic Church and its rule of celibacy, has always refused to resign his ordination. So it's a long story what happened to him, what the church did in response to this. But he still thinks of himself as a Catholic priest. And growing up, we had vestments in the front hall closet. He carries holy oils with him. In case someone should fall over dead in front of him, he'll perform last rites. He's done this. In fact, he was at my mother's a big Irish dancer, so they were at an Irish dance. And my father's famous for just sitting and not dancing, but sure enough, someone fell over dead on the floor. It seemed dead, and he rushed over and performed last rites, and the fellow revived. So he had done something right. So the fact of my parents' religious lives was really the dominating detail of my upbringing. It's something I always knew about, but in the sense of the scandal it was, really. My parents were still trying to raise a good Catholic family, despite having made this choice. And so within whatever church we would go to, we would be made to know that there was this element of law-breaking that was at the heart of our family. And it occurred to me as I was becoming an adult and reaching the age that my parents had been when they made this choice that I didn't really understand anything about the choices they had made, what had taken them into the religious life, what had made my father decide to become a priest, what had made my mother decide to become a nun. And so I took it as a kind of a journalistic challenge in a way. Could I report my family's life? Could I do interviews and do archival research and track down the story that I had just taken for granted all through my life? And I think this approach to memoir had something to do with the fact that I I can't quite recall if it was as I was writing or as I was beginning or as I was finishing. Memoirs were getting a lot of flack from being just made up. I'm thinking more specifically about a memoir called A Million Little Pieces by James Fry, which was unmasked as having some parts of it significantly fictionalized. And I thought, well, it doesn't need to be that way. There's no reason you can't write a memoir as a journalist. There's no reason that you cannot have a reported memoir. And that is how I approach my story. And I became such an evangelist for this idea that I now occasionally teach a class called The Reported Memoir at Georgetown. And I try to tell my students that it doesn't only need to be your imagination about your experiences. We leave footprints and fingerprints all through our lives that we can track down to uncover our stories again. So that's what I tried to do with my parents' experiences. And I had the great good fortune that the Catholic Church is it's an unrivaled bureaucracy. They have paper for everything. And so I could track my parents' lives through their early vocations and through leaving the church. And it taught me a lot about who they were as people in a way that I never would have known if I had not written the story.
So I'm going to have 2 more questions for me, and then I'm going to bring it out to you guys. So I hope you're starting to formulate your questions too. If you feel shy about asking questions, I have more that I can ask, but I want to be sure to leave time for all of you who are working on memoirs or interested in memoirs to ask your own questions too. So we'll do two more. The first one is about courage and respect. Let me explain what I mean. I've written one personal essay for the Washington Post, and the first version I turned into my editor. She said to me, "This is a lovely essay, but somehow you've managed to write a personal essay in which you barely appear." And I realized this thing about exposing yourself was kind of terrifying to me. And so I'd like you to talk a little bit about what it felt like to do the self-exposure part. How much courage did you feel it needed? How did you negotiate that with yourself? Did you begin by showing a lot and then taking it back? Or did you begin by showing a little and then deciding to open up more? So that's the first part. The second part, so that's self-exposure. The second part is about exposure of others. So we've had some hinting already about the bridge building or the bridge burning. But when you're writing the memoirs about your family or about, in all of these books, you're also, to a great extent, exposing people who are close to you. And some of these memoirs actually have quite explosive secrets which come out, which I will let you decide as authors whether or not you want to share or whether you will make people buy your books to read them. But I wanted you to address a little bit that issue of exposing someone else. Some of you are thinking about, and how you negotiated that, and whether you felt like that sort of ended up requiring a sort of balance of courage and respect as well. So let's start this time with Peter, and then we'll do Ariel, and then Ethelbert.
Well, as I mentioned, I never really intended to be a character in my book. It just sort of it felt the logic of the book ultimately demanded it. That's how I felt as I was writing. And I wasn't too concerned about self-exposure. I didn't feel that it took too much courage because I guess I was aware that I was creating a character. And even if I was creating a character whose experiences were exactly like mine, I was still creating a character. And so it was not, the me on the page was not me in real life, if that makes sense. Which is to say that I had control over the aspects of myself that I presented on the page. And so long as it was a believable character, I felt like it served the story well. Though it's a memoir, and though I only wrote it, I was 30 years old when I wrote it, and you think if you're 30 years old when you write a memoir, you have to have every single thing you've ever done be in there to make it worthwhile writing a book. But there are lots of things about myself I just left out because it didn't feel relevant to the story. For example, this is an aside, Ariel and I met on something called the Jewish Book Network. Though I'm a Catholic memoirist, I'm a Jewish novelist. This is a long story. But I left out a significant portion of my life in my memoir where I learned about Jewish culture, and this is not only my job, but it was an obsession, and it was right in the part of my life that I was writing about, but I thought, people are just going to read this Catholic memoir and think, this guy's a flake. He doesn't know what he thinks about anything because he's always following these different courses. And a life works that way, quite naturally, I think. All of our lives do. But on the page, maybe not so much. Maybe it's too much if you're creating a character that is yourself on the page. So there's a bit of self-editing that I think needs to happen when you're putting yourself in a memoir. I had much more difficult time with the second part of the question, which is, I can't remember the word you described for it, but
I've used a couple. One is respect, one is exposure of others.
The word that when I was
words.
searching for the word you used, the only one that was coming into my head was betrayal.
Yes, right. So that's really at the heart of it, right?
It is. It is at the heart of it, and my book does reveal a secret about my family that I didn't know going into the writing of it, and it was only revealed through the reporting of the story, and something that I don't know that my mother ever would have told me had I not been writing a book about this subject. And as I was writing the book, I would often go home and stay with my parents, and as I mentioned, this is when the Catholic sex abuse crisis was all over the news, and they lived in Boston, so especially in Boston. And I was at home one evening, at my parents' home, and I heard my parents talk in the other room. And my mother was saying something along the lines of something like, I think I should tell him. And my father was saying, honesty is a good thing. And my mother said, well, I guess you're right. And then they called me into the other room. And I remember I had been making a copy of a CD or something, so I had a black Sharpie in my hand. I was wearing sort of khaki pants. So I'm sitting there with my black Sharpie open in my khaki pants, and my parents tell me, well, it's something we have to tell you because it's going to be on the news. And my mother tells me that she had been abused by a priest when she was young, before she entered the convent. And not only had this happened, she had started a court case against the church 12 years before. And now it had gone through the rounds of the Massachusetts court system, and it was reaching the highest court in Massachusetts, the Supreme Judicial Court. And the hearing on it was maybe in 3 days. So it was going to be in the papers. And my mother had entered into this the court case as a Jane Doe, so she wasn't immediately identifiable, but if she knew that if I was reading the story, it would have been perfectly clear to me who was involved here. So I wish that my first thought was, my poor mother, I'm so sorry she went through this. But I know that my first thought was, I should be writing this down. And I truly almost wrote it on my khaki pants with my Sharpie marker. Because I was so deep in the writing of the book at that point, and the book deals with all these issues of the church and religion and sexuality, etc. I really thought in that moment, this is going to be a great book. And I was ashamed of that thought as soon as I thought it. But then I had to ask myself, this is when you ask yourself, how much will you sell your family out? And I decided that I would not include this in the story unless my mother would talk about it. And I thought it was her great courage, no courage on my part, her great courage that she allowed me to tell that story. And she sat down, and we had very uncomfortable interviews between a mother and a son about what happened to her when she was a young girl, a teenager. But she felt that if she was telling the story, she should tell the whole story. And I'm forever grateful for it, because it really showed that being written about takes as much, if not more, courage than doing the writing, I think, sometimes.
Ariel, do you want to go next?
Sure, yeah. You know, when I was teaching a course on creative writing at George Washington University, I felt like a lot of my students in the memoir segment were holding back. And that they were sort of hinting at where they were in the story, but I wasn't really feeling it. And I got the sense that a lot of them were sort of embarrassed, or that they thought that they would be, they felt like there was a sense of exposure, that they felt vulnerable. Here they were sitting, especially when you're workshopping a piece of writing. It's not like, I mean, well, when you publish it, obviously millions of people see it, but here you are with a group of people who sort of know you, they're other students, and who you have to see every day. So how much do they want to disclose? And one of the things I told them, and one of the things I've come to feel as a writer of a personal narrative is, and sort of underline this point Peter made, is that the I in memoir is us. But as soon as you commit it to paper, it ceases to be you in any sort of, perfectly sort of referential way, but becomes a symbol of you. It's a persona created to tell this particular story. And so there's this process of selection. It becomes art once it touches the page. And once you sort of tell yourself that, which I think is true, but it's also a defense mechanism, it allows you to be kind of an unsparing critic of your own life. I think memoir doesn't, I think in fiction, we're all familiar with this idea of the unreliable narrator, the narrator who's presenting one thing, but as a reader, a sharp reader, we can tell what's really going on. I don't think that works in memoir. I think memoir works only when we get a sense that the I is being a discerning, nuanced, unsparing critic of their own sort of shortcomings. This was driven home to me when, after writing the book is done fairly well in the Jewish community, I guess, not surprisingly. But different segments of the Jewish community have had very different reactions to the book. Reform Jews love it because I'm sort of a story of a very imperfect Jew who found a way to extract meaning from a past that he had long rejected. That's sort of the Reform story. Do we have to be able to check off all the boxes that the rabbis would have us check to be Jewish, or can we check off some of them and find meaning outside of, say, the God part of Judaism? I've had Orthodox Jews come up to me after book talks and say, "Thank you so much for writing this book. I've recommended it to 5 of my best friends, but shame on you." What did I do? And so they came to see the story as kind of a cautionary tale. Here's what happens to the son who strays, who doesn't listen to his father. He goes so far afield that he marries a non-Jew. He's not raising his kid exactly the Jewish way we would have him raised. We can pass this to our children to communicate to them how dangerous it is not to listen to your father. So they come up, and at first I felt hurt by this, but then I came to realize this is a character in a book. It is me, but 100% of the people, or not 100%, 99% of the people who read the book will never have met me. So who I am is, what they know of me is only what's in the book. And so what's in the book is a representation. And so that's what I'll say on self-exposure. Exposure of others, I'll sort of revert to this idea of, is it in service, are these details that you include that can be either the risk being salacious or inflammatory or sort of headline grabbing in kind of a tawdry way, are they there because you want to titillate, or are they there because they are in service of story? And if they're there because they're in service of story, then you can keep them. If they're there to titillate, to sort of have like a grabby headline or to sort of inspire gossip, leave it out. And one example from my book, there were rumors that my grandmother, my literate grandmother, had an affair at some point. My father really didn't want me investigating this. There'd never been any evidence for it, but I felt I really needed to know whether it was true, or this humble woman who barely ever left the house was capable of doing something like this. It would give me some insight into character if it were true. And so I dug around. I met with some people who knew her when she was younger, who my father didn't want me to meet with. I got a sense of how vitriolic the arguments between my grandfather and my grandmother were over whether this had happened. My grandfather, to his dying day, could never be disabused of the notion, although other people went to the Wailing Wall to swear that never, ever, and I could find no evidence that it did. But the way in which it was significant for my story was that when one sort of disreputable member of the Jewish community in Jerusalem told my grandfather that his wife had been stepping out on him, it crushed him. Because Israel had so sort of worn him down. The Kurds were sort of at the lowest sort of tier in the social strata in Israel, and he becomes sort of a broken man. And with this one sort of almost tossed off accusation, he was destroyed, as his sense of manhood was destroyed. And so for me, the details were significant only insofar as this accusation sort of broke my grandfather. I had a choice to make about whether I would go into the details about the fact that my grandfather said that he regretted ever marrying her, that the language they used when they cursed at each other, the drag out fights, that would have been titillating. Did it advance the story? No. The only thing that advanced the story was that the accusation was there. There's a brief scene in which we see it. and to the degree in which it advances the story of my grandfather's sort of fall in Israel, it was significant, but beyond that, it wasn't. So I had to make a sort of executive decision about how much to include, and I decided to include very little.
Yeah, I think in every household there are secrets, and what you have to determine is, as a writer, what you're going to tell or not tell. And then I also think in every family there's a defining moment, like the Bay of Pigs, that you have to navigate that also. For my family, the most defining moment, as far as my analysis, was my brother Richard's decision in the early 60s to go into the monastery, to become a Trappist monk. That was a major decision. As a father today, I now see what my mother and father went through, giving up their child. I also thought that my brother went into the monastery because he was reading all this Thomas Merton material. But actually I found out that the strongest influence on my brother deciding to become a monk was my father, who I never saw as a spiritual person. But this is what happens in terms of, if you're the baby of the family, how your parents interact with each child is different. The oldest one might be closer because at that time your father or mother is young. Your father would throw you up in the air and catch you. I told people that by the time I came along, he dropped me. So you have to go through that in terms of finding these issues which you have to write about. If I looked at my first memoir, Father and Word, you will see that there's a lot I don't know. So there's a lot of questions I'm asking. I'm just making these probes. I'm searching. And that's key for the first memoir. Now, as I tell people, there's sequels to everything except Catwoman with Halle Berry.
There's sequels.
So what happens in terms of, when I look at the second memoir, the first one I was mapping my life, who am I, this type of thing. The second one, the fifth inning, I'm mining my life. I'm digging deeper. I'm looking at what happened when we reach middle age. Okay, we start to lose the friends. All of a sudden now we're dealing with our own mortality. We see people dying around us. Right now, for example, I use baseball as a metaphor. For many of us, it is the fifth inning. All of a sudden you thought you were going to have a pension and retire, but somebody says, "Give me the ball."
I have to interject here that Ethelbert is at least 2 decades older than he was. I'm 30.
No, I'm not.
Not actually a 35-year-old saying that now he's in the fifth inning.
Right. I'm in the extra innings now. And what happened is that this is where I think you deal with these questions of honesty. Your children are older. Okay. I was very much concerned now in a second memoir. I want to protect the privacy of my kids. I didn't want a graduate student interviewing them, locking them in time. I saw what had happened to my sister when I wrote about her in my first memoir. When my sister would come down to D.C. to visit me and we'd be out at a public gathering and say, "Oh, that's your sister? I thought she'd be one of them big church women with a hat." And so I didn't want, my children to be looked at through the text. And so I held back at certain things. But then I was exploring failed relationships. I was looking at what happens when you're in these jobs that are going nowhere. I was tired of some of the talk shows, you say. Like, for example, we live in the time of celebrities, right, and scandals and all this stuff. And what happened, I'm always looking at, what's the guy, the governor of South Carolina? What, Sanford? I like this guy. I like this guy because he was in love. You know what I mean? Here I am. I'm a Neruda guy.